NASA Acres is working to bring the value of satellite imagery to farmers and the agriculture industry in the U.S. In this week's episode, I'm joined by NASA Acres Deputy Director Mike Humber to talk about how NASA Acres is working to build trust and bridge the gap for greater adoption of satellite industry. What you'll hear from Mike is that this is largely about building relationships, forming partnerships, and hearing directly from farmers about their needs. We talk about how farmers use satellite imagery, the potential for greater adoption, and how NASA is trying to approach this work in a responsible way with agriculture data transparency. I hope you enjoy the episode. I'm Rachel Jewett, and you're listening to On Orbit, the podcast that asks, what's our future in space? Hi, Mike. Welcome to the On Orbit podcast.
Hey, Rachel. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Yes. So I'm super excited to have NASA Acres represented. I understand that NASA Acres it's about a year and a half old and working to bring the benefits of satellite imagery to the agriculture industry in the US. So I'm really excited to hear more from you.
Great. Yeah, I think this is a really awesome opportunity for us to talk to your audience here. NASA Acres, as you just mentioned, is about a year and a half old. It's NASA's consortium focused on agriculture and food security, but specifically domestically here in the U.S. So we're relatively new, but we're loosely based on a model that was piloted by our sister consortium, NASA Harvest, which was focused on global food security and agriculture. So that goes back to about 2017 was when that was really kicked off. And the concept behind the two NASA Ag Consortia is that they're part of the program area for agriculture under NASA, but they are directed by researchers that are based out of universities. So, for example, in our case, we're based out of the University of Maryland, but we work very closely in collaboration with our colleagues at NASA HQ, and that really allows us to be more agile in what we do. So not only adapting to changing conditions, but also to identify and pursue new research opportunities as they come up and as we learn about things from farmers and from industry and from the different policymakers. So it's a really sort of a different model. We have 11 different universities participating, 14 different projects going on. But really the goal is to promote the use of satellite Earth observations.
Yeah, that's awesome. As you were saying, it was developed partially on the model of NASA Harvest. Hannah Kerner was my very first On Orbit interview before I hosted the podcast. My colleague Jeff hosted, but I did a guest episode where I talked to her about NASA Harvest. And gosh, that was almost 5 years ago at this point. So excited to hear about NASA Acres and beyond NASA Harvest. So are you based at the University of Maryland?
I am actually. I've been at the University of Maryland since I was an undergrad, and I just sort of stuck around and never left. So I've been at UMD since 2007, but working officially with the agriculture program since 2013 or so.
Very cool. And then tell me a little bit more about what you do as Deputy Director of NASA Acres.
Sure. So I'm the deputy director. That puts me in a really sort of engaging position, I think, to connect a lot of really fantastic researchers that are doing state-of-the-art work with really the people that can benefit from that, whether that's farmers or policymakers or people in the ag industry. And a lot of this really comes down to how do we communicate those needs across those different groups so that we can operationalize that work. So I've been in that role since the consortium was launched last year. Prior to that, I was and still am the data lead and the markets, trade, and supply chains lead for NASA Harvest. And I'm also the lead scientist for Climate Smart Agriculture in Maryland's Climate Resilience Network. So that's all really just to say that we do a lot of thinking about how satellite data can help understand production, not just at one scale, but across the local, national, and global scales.
Yeah, so you are very plugged into this area. Was there something about agriculture that drew you personally to this work?
I think I just really love doing the applied science side of things. When I first started, I was actually mainly focused on developing web applications and web maps using forest cover data and some what we were calling preliminary classifications of satellite imagery. And I think that just sort of grew as we started developing new projects under the different agriculture projects way before Acres or Harvest were were established. And I think just being connected and tapped into the sort of needs of the community really was just quite appealing to me. And I think that agriculture is a very applied system right now. It's, the farmers that we're working with have data needs today. They don't have needs for 5 years from now when the projects have run their course and you're publishing your final paper. It's really, how do I make a decision that is more environmentally beneficial, more profitable right now? Because if you think about how, a farmer's career trajectory goes, they might get 30, 40 harvests in one career. So how many of those do you want to spend experimenting when your payday is really, tied to that few seasons?
Yeah, absolutely. it has a very real world impact to this data, like in the current harvest, like you said, not just, years down the line. Um, why do you think it's important for NASA to have for there to be this consortium that's working directly with the agriculture industry in the US?
So that's a really great question, and a lot of it has to do with the history of satellite observations in general. I think most people don't realize that agriculture was actually one of the very first uses for satellite data. Agriculture, going back to 1973, with it was back then as they called it the Great Russian Grain Robbery. The U.S. had no idea how much was being produced in the Soviet Union at the time, and there was a big drought, big shortfall in production, and there was an information asymmetry because the USSR knew that they were going to have a shortfall. They were able to purchase a lot of subsidized wheat from the United States. And then by the time the rest of the world realized that there was a shortfall in Russia, the price had spiked and the price of wheat globally went up dramatically. And as a response to that, NASA had somewhat fortuitously just launched ERTS-1, now known as Landsat-1. And they had developed these programs that were designed to see how can we use that data to estimate production around the world. And programs like the LACY Large Area Crop Inventory Experiment and AgriStars were actually getting really good estimates of yield even back in the 70s and 80s.
Hmm.
So there's a really strong legacy of NASA and agriculture, but it's something where the technology sort of plateaued for a while, and now we're trying to pick back up and really deliver on that promise of remote sensing technology for the agricultural sector.
That is really interesting. I'll tell you a little bit about my interest in agriculture for the satellite industry. It started a little bit more on the communication side, like satellite communications. I went to the John Deere Industry Day, and longtime on orbit listeners would know that we've had John Deere on the podcast before. But so I've covered that, and then also looking at CNH Industrial and Case IH, looking at the same type of solution, putting SATCOM on agriculture machines, and actually went to Farm Progress this year to talk to the companies. And it was my first agriculture show, my first really non-satellite industry show, and I went to Iowa by myself. It was a really cool experience. So it's something that I'm really interested in is how satellite technology enables agriculture, whether that's communication or imagery and sensing.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's so many great people. It's such a diverse industry, really. I mean, you have the tech side of it, you have the farming focus side of it, you have the ag tech side that's operating somewhere in the middle with a lot of these new startups popping up. It's a really
Yeah.
vibrant ecosystem.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to talk about today was I heard about the NASA Acres survey that you all did, surveying farmers working with Trust in Food and Ag Data Transparent. So could you kind of give the background of what the issue of ag data transparency means and why this study was important for NASA Acres to work on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, our survey that we ran with Trust in Food and ADT was really eye-opening for a lot of reasons. And I think it's important. It's actually really essential to understand that people's attitudes towards their data vary depending on where they are and what's going on around them and their own personal feelings towards it. So having come from a global agriculture perspective and, prior to Acres under NASA Harvest, um, we learn pretty quickly, and you sort of know it, you don't have to learn it, but you can't apply the same thinking with European farmers and African farmers and then take those and apply those to US farmers. The privacy laws are different in different places, obviously. The way people value their data is different, and how people understand their intellectual property rights is very different as well. So what we did was we looked at this survey as an opportunity to do market research, and I kind of say market research in air quotes a little bit there, just because we're of course not selling anything,
Yeah.
but what we want to really understand is how do farmers feel about their data privacy and transparency? How do they feel about NASA? How do they feel about NASA acres? And part of that is really understanding who out there is going to be more willing to work with us as direct collaborators, who are the people we should reach out to develop new research topics to test our models. And I think gets back to that issue of, frankly, a lot of people really don't even know that NASA does anything related to agriculture. So I think that means that, in order to get people to work with us on developing and validating and making sure our models are correct, we need to first let them know that we're here and we're doing this. And then from there, work with them to understand which data they're comfortable sharing and recognize that, their data from their fields that's their intellectual property. Not everyone wants to share that, but given that we have time constraints related to the growing season, and we have limited resources, limited number of people we can send to collect this information, I think this survey really helps us target our most likely collaborators to be more efficient in developing those relationships on the whole.
Yeah, yeah. Um, what are some of the like pain points and concerns that farmers have with ag data transparency?
Yeah, pain points is really a great term for it. I think different farmers, of course, have different issues with sharing their data, and that sounds really simple when you distill it down to a phrase like that. But there's such a wide range of attitudes that people have, and all of them, when you think about it and you listen to the argument, they all make sense on why they would share, why they would not share. No one's doing anything illogical. It's just how you feel about it. And we've come across some farmers that'll tell you, hey, you can have all of my data, just let me know what comes out of it. And on the other side, I've had someone tell me word for word, sure, you can have my data. Do you want my wallet and my social security number too while you're at it? So, at the end of the day,
Wow.
these people, they're running a business, right? And they're making business decisions. They're going to do things that are going to keep them profitable and in business. And that means, increasing yields, decreasing costs, might be improving soil health, reducing yield volatility. But how that information gets them to that point really kind of depends. So there's also this sort of more outward-looking issue that farmers see too. Some of them are afraid that their data might be used to punish them down the line. So say they're using a fertilizer now that everyone thinks is fine, but then years from now we find out there's some bad environmental outcome from it. They don't want to have their data floating around there with their name attached to it. So a regulatory body from an uncertain future can come in and fine them for it. So their data can become a liability if it's not well protected. So you really have to kind of be careful of those sorts of concerns as well. And then another common one we hear is like, your neighbors might be your farmers and your colleagues and your friends, but they're also your competitors. So there's a business case to how much do I want to share that will help my competition. And if I'm giving you my data, I want to make sure that I'm getting more out of it than my neighbor is. So I mean, there are many pain points. They're all, to be honest with you, they're all valid concerns about the
Hmm.
the risks and the valuations and how a farmer values risk versus reward there. Really, it's sort of some people are going to be more willing to work with you, some people are not. And this really kind of ties back into what we've been doing with Ag Data Transparent and setting up our data use agreements to make sure that all of that is just really clear to the farmer, as clear as we can be.
Yeah, so what does that mean? What are the actually no, before I ask that question, when you say giving us their data, does that mean like because there are so many different types of data that can be collected on a farm. Does that what all goes into that? And another aspect of that question is, satellite, NASA satellites are looking at everything. So some of that, it might be specific to a person's farm, but it's also imagery that NASA satellites are collecting anyways.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. And when we say giving us the data, it's actually the way that we structure our interactions with farmers and the way that we work with the data is that we put in place a data use agreement.
Okay.
And that data use agreement makes it clear, and clarity really is kind of the key point to a lot, is being transparent and being clear so that everyone knows what's going on, who's allowed to do what with what data. And part of what we want to emphasize is that that data, even though the farmer might be allowing us to use it or licensing us to use it, it's still their intellectual property. If they change their mind later on, we have provisions in that agreement that says you can revoke our permission, our license to use this data. it's yours. We'll delete it from our systems, and if we want to circle back to this around later, we can. So I think that it is really important to highlight that we do view the data as belonging to the farmer, and it's licensed to us for specific use, and we can share it with we actually have it's exclusion by default in the agreement, so we can only share it with the people that are specifically mentioned in the data use agreement. So we very tightly parameterize that so that the farmer knows exactly what we're doing with it, and we know that they're on board with it.
Mhm.
And the sorry, what was the second part of the
Oh,
there?
the second part was just that some of the like what's happening in terms of crops is going to be specific to a farm, but satellites are looking at everything. It's basically, like Landsat is collecting, is looking at that regardless, but I'm sure that you guys aren't using it in a person specific way. It's more just to collect broad observations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's also a really good point, and that's something that's in a separate document that we have that's focused on our sort of data principles and how we
Mhm.
want our different project leads to work with farmers and with their data, and part of that has to do with we don't want to be putting out data that could be used in any sort of punitive way against the farmer. So we might map things at the pixel level, but the results that we're going to publish in a peer-reviewed journal or something like that, we're typically going to aggregate those up to county level, let's say. And if people want to work with the pixel level data, then that can be a separate conversation that we'll have, provided that it's allowed by the data use agreements that the farmers have signed on to. But we do want to be sure that the farmers really are not being put out there by the data that we're producing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important for building trust and making sure that everything has the helpful intended impact that you all are wanting to make. So, what are some of the characteristics of an early adopter and someone who is like, give me all the data, let's really work together on this?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. There's a lot of different ways that you can slice up the pie, and this is really what came out of a lot of the raw data that we got from the survey itself. We had over 1,000 responses, completed surveys, which I commend everyone that did that because it was a very long survey,
That's
to be honest
awesome.
with you. So we're still sifting through a lot of the results. And there is an element of sort of putting people into these categories of early adopters and large farms versus small farms and those sorts of things, owner operators versus operators and all of that. Um, the part that's really interesting for us is drilling down into that group that says that they are willing to work with NASA under this sort of acres research type of environment, and that definitely fits that early adopters category. Interestingly, I think a lot of the responses that we got that fit into that category tend to be larger operations, and I think that they have a little bit more capacity to experiment because if they do it on a small area, then that is overall less risk to the entire operation. We also see that there's a little bit of well, we didn't ask for age, but there's a bit of a bias towards newer farmers being a little bit more willing to try to work with the satellite data than the more veteran farmers. So there's a little bit of that in there, but I think that's stuff that we're trying to tease out a little bit more from the survey itself.
Hmm. That's interesting. So, how do you think that this survey could lead to greater Earth observation adoption?
I think that I mean, one of the things that we learned up front is that not many farmers are aware that NASA is working with agriculture in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the questions that we asked was, what is your level of awareness of NASA's agriculture activities? And 70% of them said they had little or no awareness that NASA was working with agriculture. So there is a lot of room for us to grow there. At the same time, I think about half of the respondents said that they see value in using satellite data. So it's a bit of a fascinating opportunity because NASA is, when you think about it, one of the strongest brands in the world. Everyone knows the NASA logo. But at the same time, they don't know that NASA's been working on agriculture for 45, 50 years at this point. So when we say let's work together, and people say, great, our potential audience is actually like more than double that, two and a half times that. If you think about 70% don't even know that we're working in that area. So um, from our perspective, I think that that really shows us, we have room to grow. We know that these people are most likely to use satellite data, and from there we started to break down what are the concerns that farmers have about working with someone like an NASA Acres. And some of the main answers that we got were government regulatory pressure was a concern that they had, costs for maintaining the technology, uh, prices of inputs, so like seeds and crop protection were a big theme, and then the long-term profitability. So if you boil that down, it turns out that the biggest concerns are regulation and then improving profitability, mostly by reducing costs. So I think what we learned from that as NASA Acres is that we need to balance that value proposition of our science. What is the actual improvement that we can have someone try to achieve on their operation, balancing that with the perceived risk that the farmer sees of those potential government regulatory pressures. So we really wanted to delve into that and see, who do the farmers trust, if it's
Yeah.
us or if it's someone else. And we found that no one trusts the EPA, which was an interesting outcome. Um, the most trusted people were typically banks and business advisors, the people coming out and telling you how to use the products. We found that NASA actually rated somewhat well. Somewhat trusted or completely trusted, depending on the type of data, was between 22 to 37%. But then if you also add that neutral category in there of neither trust nor distrust, that goes up into the 70s. So that's not a bad outcome. We're actually relatively in line with USDA on those numbers, according to the survey. Interestingly, the university research extension offices rated quite well, and that's something that is a bit actionable for us because as a consortium, we are made up of largely a collection of different universities. So I think having that connection back to the university helps raise the trust level a bit, and farmers are largely more comfortable working with the universities directly. So I think that that also plays into how we structure the data use agreements, because those are going to be coming from the universities, since
Mhm.
that's the legal entity that's allowed to engage in those types of agreements. So, I think that all sort of barely scratches the surface, but there is definitely a lot of really actionable insight from this survey.
That is interesting that universities were ranking very high in trust, and NASA Acres is working with is a consortium of universities. So I think there's a great opportunity there, like you said. One question I have about farming and satellite imagery is, what do you think most farmers are using? Is it like free imagery from NASA that's been bundled into products, or are they using data from commercial providers?
I think that to be completely honest, the way that we deliver data as NASA can be a little bit intimidating to work with. So, when you're working with those raw formats like HDF and GeoTIFF and NetCDF, um, it's not a super friendly format for people to get involved with. So I think that there are definitely people that are using that data, and there are ways that we can improve the access to that data. OpenET, for example, is working directly with farmers and with water resource managers in the Western US, looking at the evapotranspiration, then using that in a sort of nice and easy to understand format to actually control the water management and irrigation in those areas. So I think that it's a bit of a combination, because those types of data are so valuable that it's really important that people are using them, and the systems kind of come and make those more user friendly. That said, I know there are definitely a lot of companies out there in the private sector that are sort of going directly to farmers and offering them these higher resolution products that are being used by farmers. So I think it's definitely a little bit of both. I don't imagine there are too many people out there just directly downloading the Landsat products or Modus products and using them directly. But what we try to do is provide them in an application or a system that turns that data into a web map that's a little more usable and user friendly.
Yeah, gotcha. So how is how else is NASA Acres working to bridge the adoption gap and help give people easier access to satellite imagery?
I think a lot of this adoption gap really kind of can be addressed by improving communications. And I think that in turn helps solve a lot of problems because what we're trying to do is really be transparent and clear with the farmers. And that also extends out to how we present our research. So not just the data use agreements, but also making sure that our data is in an accessible and friendly format. And really what sort of underpins that is that you need to meet people where they are, both, physically where they're located, but also in sort of a, where you are in life sense in order to understand what it is that they need to know. And there's really quite a lot of work there that needs to be done to translate an operational or a science quality product into something that people can use in their own decision making. So we really kind of need to go from things that we find interesting from the research and development side of things into things that are telling the farmer, the policymaker, the ag advisor what it is that they need to know. We're also really working to broaden our research communications by going through different growers associations, both at the state and the national levels. So it might not, well, it's certainly not possible for us to reach, for example, every grower in Illinois individually, but if we're partnered with the Illinois Corn Growers Association, we can reach a lot of them at once. And I think that the other side of that is that what those different growers associations brings to the table is trust that already in place. And I think that trust is another challenge to adoption. We of course want people to trust us as individuals, but it's also perhaps even more important that they trust the data itself and that they're making a good quality informed decision based on that data. So if you have a soil moisture data set, for example, and you say that it's the soil is too dry, someone might make a decision that they're going to irrigate. But if that data is wrong, then at best they're wasting money, and at worst, you could be damaging the crops. So part of what we want to do in order to really kind of improve the efficacy of the data is, first of all, emphasize that the products that we're creating should be validated and well understood, and that we also need to communicate those uncertainties that go along with the products as well, so that people understand the limitations of what it is that we're putting out there. There is no perfect model. I think that's absolutely true in remote sensing as well. So making sure that people understand limitations is a really key point.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of the work that you guys have to do is really about relationship building.
Absolutely. Agriculture is a very difficult thing to map because it's such a dynamic surface to actually look at. When you think of how your annual row crops grow, your seasonal row crops grow, you go from, bare soil to corn over the course of 3 months to harvest, and then you're back to nothing on the field, and you really only have a very short period to map that specific season, and then you rinse and repeat that through time, and every season's going to look different. Practices are going to change, the seed genetics are going to change, and all of that means that you need to have a constant stream of information that backstops those models. And in order to do that, you need to have really good relationships with a lot of farmers in order to make sure that what you're putting out is keeping up with the changes in the ground.
Very cool. So are you guys um, looking for like individual farmers or groups to reach out and if they're interested in working more closely with NASA Acres?
Absolutely, and that actually that's a really exciting point that you bring up because we're actually working on this new initiative that we call the Farmer Innovation Ambassador Team, and Fiat for short. And this is a really exciting thing that we're doing. We're bringing Purdue and Kansas State University into the fold, and the idea is to build a network of farmers that can represent as many different states and crops as possible, and have them give us input into what it is that we're doing as acres. So identify what are the things that are important on your farm and important in your community, and really act as trusted advisors that highlight those issues so that we can see who we can connect across our own network to really address those needs. So I think that there's a really great opportunity for people to be involved through a program like that, and to really, get in touch with us directly because I think that we want to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. The issues that we see with farming in Iowa are not going to be the same issues that we see with farming on the eastern shore of Maryland, and making sure that all of those or as many of those are being captured as we can is really quite important.
Yeah, that's that's a good point. It sounds like you guys have accomplished a lot in the year and a half that NASA Acres has been around. So it's really a lot of interesting things that you guys have underway. Do you work with commercial satellite operators in NASA at NASA Acres?
So we have a under NASA, there's the commercial small sat data buy.
Yeah.
So that's a program that we are sort of understanding how do we work more directly through NASA on the CSDA to get our hands on the different commercial data that we're working with. We have done various pilots throughout the last year and a half looking at different types of data. I don't know that I'm actually allowed to disclose which ones. But we've worked with different vendors to evaluate their data and how that data can be used in the agriculture context. So I think there's so much opportunity there. There's, a bit of that boundary where NASA and ESA aren't going to go below, say, 10-meter resolution or so. And really that's where the commercial systems really are the only option out there. And I think that there's a sort of place that we can sort of meet in the middle and bringing that data and getting it into a sort of science quality data set as far as calibration, things like that go, in order to make a good value proposition to the farmers, to industry about how that data can be used in the real world.
hmm Yeah, agriculture is one of the main use cases from like new Earth observation companies. They always say, "Oh, we want to serve agriculture," but like you said, the needs of a farm in Iowa are completely different from the eastern shore of Maryland. So it's such a diverse and varied industry, and I think that from what I've heard from those companies, it's hard to make products that are, applicable in a lot of different situations. So it's like everyone wants to help this market, but it's very difficult to bridge that gap of the commercial company. And, one company isn't even going to have the resources of like the listening tour that NASA Acres is doing. So I think it's like, I think there's a lot of potential, but there's challenges to bridge that gap.
Absolutely. And I think what you see in the commercial sector is that a lot of those products that are going out to farmers are very regionalized. There's not
Mm.
really a lot of people that are making national scale recommendations and products for agricultural purposes. And I think that what you said really sort of hits the nail on the head there, that it's those things are so different from location to location. And when you're working with 10 centimeter, 15 centimeter resolution, the seed variety matters, the row spacing matters, all of those sorts of things come into play that in addition to things like the atmospheric correction and cross platform calibration, a lot of those things are easier to calibrate with coarser resolution, or they start to average out at a lower resolution. So there are absolutely very difficult problems that I think make it quite hard to do that with really high resolution data. But I'm confident we're getting there, right? There's a lot of opportunity. It's a huge market. Agriculture in the U.S. is $1 trillion a year industry. So there's a lot to do there.
Yeah. What are some of the goals for NASA Acres in 2025, and what are some of the like projects that you guys are working on for the coming year?
I think in terms of goals, that Fiat program is really exciting to us. That's something that I'd really like to see get off the ground and sort of immediately be successful. So that's one that I think early to mid next year we're hoping to have sort of off and running. Um, Beyond that, there's a lot of really awesome work going on with the different collaborators under NASA Acres. Just to name a few, I mean, we're looking at yield estimation, of course. We have some nice work on field boundary identification, tillage mapping across the Corn Belt. We're looking at soil moisture using radar sources. We have some collaborators in Cornell using hyperspectral data to map plant pathogens. We're looking at farm level economic analyses, nitrogen content, evapotranspiration, water management, really just a really great suite of work going on. And this is all sort of tied together by what we call the essential agricultural variables. And that guides a lot of what we do. And that's the collection of things that we either know we can map with satellite data or we think that we can map with satellite data if we have the right sensor. So looking forward, when you have something like an SPG mission out and hyperspectral capabilities, 30-meter resolution, what does that improve your capacity to do? So that's sort of on the science and research side. On the other hand, we do work quite closely with our colleagues at the NASA headquarters program area for agriculture on workforce development and trying to design educational programs and curriculum that we can use to get some training out there, do some internship types of things, and really the goal is to move towards a situation where we have satellite data products in the hands of the current and the future practitioners in agriculture. So, my dream scenario would be a couple of years from now, we just consider satellite data to be a ubiquitous part of managing your agricultural system. So I think that there's quite a lot really kind of on tap for next year. And I know it's early, but actually we're already planning our NASA booth and activities at the Commodity Classic in Denver next March. So anyone that wants to come and learn about NASA's agriculture program area and what NASA Acres is doing, it's a really great opportunity to meet with us and ask questions and learn about what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that's awesome that you guys will have a presence at that show and just be right there so people can ask questions. That's really cool. Well, Mike, this has been such an interesting conversation. I really appreciate your perspective into the agriculture industry and how satellite imagery can help the agriculture industry. So, anything else that you want to share?
No, this has been great. Really enjoyed the conversation. I think there's so much going on. I think there's a lot of issues going on that need solutions right now. So I think that the transition towards a more applied approach for a lot of these products is really what's needed right now. And I think that we're quite well positioned to do it, but we also we need to engage the community, whether that's other researchers, whether that's the commercial space sector, whether that's farmers and growers associations. I think that it's really gonna it's gonna take a village, and there's a lot of room to operate here. So really excited to engage with anyone that's looking to work with us, and please do feel free to reach out.
Yes, awesome. So, listeners, if this is relevant, interesting to you, get in touch with Mike and NASA Acres. All right, thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel. It's been great.